My name is Richard Brown, and I'd like to welcome everyone today to the Letcher County History Show. Today we'll be talking about World War I and some of the Letcher Countyans that were involved in this epic battle. First off, I'd like to show everyone a few of the Letcher Countyans that were in this fight. This picture here is of Willie Collins and Melvin Cornett and Dimmer Richmond, and this one here is Avery Caudle, and then J.D. Maggard and Lawrence Maggard. And coming on across, we'll have Matt Caudle, Avery Caudle, Dimmer Richmond, Willie Collins, and Melvin Cornett again. And coming in a clockwise still yet, in this picture here you have Melvin. He's kind of acting the fool, as you can tell. And then you also have his, I forget there's another Cornett boy here, and this is Dimmer Richmond here. And then over here you'll have, these are the grandsons of W.W. Webb that all served in World War I. And this will be Townsville Adams. This one will be Frank Kraft, and then Wiley Adams and Wiley Kraft and John Webb. Then on this side we'll have John Kraft and his wife Esther Kraft. Both of them also served in World War I. And there was a lot more people that served in World War I from around here, but that's the ones we have the pictures of. And today I was fortunate enough to be able to get to use Ben B. Taylor's pointer stick, his airborne. And if you'd like to see it, it's here at the museum. Now that we've saw the pictures of some of the Letcher Countyans, I'd like to introduce you to one of them that was in the picture, which was Dimmer Richmond. That was my great uncle. And I do have his story about being in World War I. Starting off with, when World War I broke out, the United States tried to stay out of it as long as possible, and they did. There was a lot of mass killings going on, and for another reason they stayed out of it, not only was they wasn't interested in going overseas, is the United States actually had a weak army at that time, that we were ill-equipped, and we didn't actually have a very big standing army. It was mostly state militias, which people today call them National Guards. Each state had their own militia. Well, Dimmer, he was born on the head of Little Collie here in Letcher County. He was the son of Owen Richmond and Susan Collins Richmond. And he, growing up, he was the grandson of two. His grandfathers had both been in the war between the states, the Civil War, and like most people around here, one was fought for the North, one had fought for the South. Jonathan Richmond had been in the 64th Virginia for the Confederacy, and Henry Powell Collins was in the 14th Kentucky Cavalry for the Union. So no doubt at dinners and so forth, he probably got to hear different viewpoints of how that war evolved and how it ended. Well, he was born in 1897, and as he grew up, like all country boys, he quickly learned how to hunt and fish and shoot a rifle, which would later on serve him well. And there wasn't much going on around here in the turn of the century, so he and a few more of the Letcher County boys decided they would join the state militia. So they joined the Kentucky State Militia and went and trained at Fort Thomas, Kentucky. Then after they got trained, through basic and training, they went and traveled all over the state and the United States both, getting other training, because we were not at war at this time, of course. This was in 1916. They traveled around in 1917, and in 1917, that was when President Woodrow Wilson finally decided that we're going to have to enter the war, and he declared war in April of 1917. Well, we couldn't send troops right away because we did not have the troops to send. So they decided to formed these state militias into regular Army groups. And so the boys from here in Letcher County were formed into what they called the 166th Infantry. Well, then they put them into a division, and they put them in the 42nd Division. MacArthur, when he was for a while over the 42nd, he said, let's take and call this in the Rainbow Division. And somebody asked him why, and he said, well, it's because it's like a rainbow going across the whole country. We have men from Kentucky, Virginia, Ohio, Texas, California, all of them in one big division. It's like a rainbow going all the way across the country. And that name stuck. And today it's still called the 42nd. It's still called the Rainbow Division. Well, the Rainbow Division was put into troop ships and begun the long trip across the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, that was the only way to get troops across from one continent to the other was by ship, of course, across the ocean. Well, when they got there, the Germans, of course, knew they were coming, and the war had been pretty much a stalemate for a while now. It had been fought to a stalemate, and the Germans thought, well, before them fresh Americans get here, we'll go ahead and launch a major offensive and take most of France before they can get here. But what they didn't realize was that the American soldiers traveled fast and quick. The Germans were used to the French and the English because they were moved so slow. They were, matter of fact, a lot of times they were made fun of for moving so slow. Take them forever to get anywhere. So the Germans took their time making their attack, and it was going to be called the Champagne-Marne. Well, when the Germans attacked, lo and behold, the Americans were already in the trenches, and they wasn't expecting that. And the fierce battles that were fought there pushed the Germans back for several miles, and so then they had to form new lines again, which surprised the Germans greatly because they wasn't expecting this. Well, then we settled down into a trench warfare for a while, which trench warfare had already been going on for quite some time. And in this is when they were the big trenches, and they'd be probably about 3 foot wide and 6 foot to 7 foot deep. And of course, you know what that meant. The water, mud, and everything was in the bottom of these. So soldiers were constantly having foot rot. Well, and not only that, is when the soldiers would end up attacking each other and getting in these trenches, they would have to fight hand to hand, so there's a whole lot of brutal combat. And the American soldiers had all long bayonets to put on their Springfield rifles. Well, in the 166th, everyone knew that Dimmer had been a blacksmith when he was growing up in Letcher County. So they decided to cut their bayonets down and make more like a trench knife out of them. Some of the wealthier soldiers had sent home and had Bowie knives sent over to them, much like this one right here. In this one, you can see why it would be a benefit to them, because in the trenches where you didn't have room, you could stab and you could use this to fight with. But of course, a lot of the American soldiers could not afford to have this sent to them, and plus they didn't have the time sent to them. But that was this was a very good trench knife to fight hand to hand. Well, since a lot of them couldn't get that, they done the next best thing. They made their own. So they took these big long bayonets and they had Dimmer cut them down. Then he'd also cut down the scabbards. But you can see it went from it's just half of the size of the bayonet used to be. But now a soldier could use it to fight with in those close quarters of the trenches. And I was very fortunate to have my great uncle's trench knife. And matter of fact, I'll be leaving it with the museum if they would like to, for anyone to actually see it in person. And of course, one helmet, because you know the doughboys, as the soldiers were called then, they didn't have. This is the type of helmet they wore. Not like the helmets that you're used to seeing in World War II and the Vietnam soldiers were. And of course today the helmets are even different. Well, the fighting in the trenches was, like I say, very, very terrible, very brutal. And General John Pershing was the commander of all American troops. And he started studying this trench warfare, and he saw this was going nowhere. It was just going to get a lot of Americans killed, just like it already had the English, the French, and the Germans. So he thought a good thing that he'd been interviewing George Patton, which George Patton, everyone knows, goes on to be a hero of World War II. Well, even in World War I, Patton was very daring and very independent. And so when he saw how Patton was doing with his regiment, everybody was getting on to Patton. But he thought maybe that's not such a bad thing. So he decided to have all of his commanders be independent leaders. Because up to this point, everyone was commanded by one officer on the front line. And so naturally, when you're strung out over miles of front line, you have no idea what the officers really want you to do, because you have no idea, you can't see. So Pershing, which they called him Blackjack, he had the great idea of saying, listen, my commanders are all going to be independent and fight by their own unit. And that's what he done. He had each one of the commanders become very independent, and he explained how Patton did it. Then Patton brought in another new thing, and that was these tanks. And so they brought the tanks in, and he decided he was going to launch a very big offensive. And so he planned the date, and he told the Allies, the English and the French, about it. Well, lo and behold, apparently the English and French didn't think much of secrecy. So they published the date and the time of the battle, of the attack, in the local newspapers, which of course now the Germans know when it was coming. Well, Pershing just put him in a dilemma. He said, now I've had all this planning, the soldiers are all ready to go. So he hastily calls a quick meeting of his commanders and said, what do we do? And of course, most of them, and especially Patton, jumped up and said, we're going to go. Said, my men are in these mud, in these trenches, their feet are rotting off, and they're wanting out of it. Says, they know we're coming, they probably would know anyway. Says, let's go. And so that's what they decided to do. Pershing agreed with them, and so the order to come climb out of the trenches and charge forward was given. So they charged forward, and even though the Germans know they were coming, they still managed to push the Germans back. And they pushed them back at least 6 to 7 miles before the Germans finally had reserves come up and stop the onslaught. And again, what helped stop them was a terrible act of war, and it was called mustard gas. The Germans launched all these shells that, when exploded, put out mustard gas. And Dimmer, like all the rest of his comrades, had this mustard gas get down on them. And of course, most of them had masks, and they tried to get them on. And he got his on most of the time in time. Sometimes he didn't, and he would later pay for this, because he would later lose one of his lungs due to this mustard gas. But this is what stopped the Americans in their tracks. That was the only thing that could stop them. Both sides dug in, and then at this time they prepared for another large battle, and actually it's going to be the largest battle ever in the world up to this time, and that was going to be called the Battle of the Argonne Forest. They were going to cross the Moose River and attack the Germans right where they hurt them the most, right where all their train tracks, their depots, everything was. But it would take a monster of a invasion to do this. Well, the French were facing this portion of the Argonne Forest, and they were worn out by this time, and they just didn't have the get up and go to them to carry on the attack. And Pershing knowed this, but also the Germans knowed this, so they were not expecting an attack to come from this area of the battlefield, the Western Front. So here is at this time one of the most amazing feats of the war occurred. The Americans quietly and through the nights slipped thousands and thousands of American soldiers into the French trenches, and at the same time the French would take and come back out of the trenches. They did this till there's 500,000 American soldiers lined up across from the Argonne Forest, and the Germans had no clue they were facing the Americans. They thought they were still facing the French. And on that morning, about 2,900 artillery pieces opened up and began to shower the Germans with artillery barrage. And this continued for 3 hours. And at the end of the 3 hours, each commander in his regiment all rose out of the trenches and charged the Germans, Dimmer included, and all these Letcher Countyans. And they charged across what they called no man's land. And the fierce onslaught absolutely caught the Germans by surprise, and they pushed them back for a long way. And it taught the Germans a lesson. In this type of battle where they used tanks and fast-moving soldiers' attacks was what the Germans would later call blitzkrieg, lightning warfare. And we all know what happened in World War II when the Germans practiced it. They pushed and took over all the surrounding countries, French, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, all of them. They took them over with this blitzkrieg type lightning fight, fast attacks. And they had learned this, unfortunately, from the Americans during this battle of the Argonne Forest. But getting back to our story, the Americans managed to keep pushing them and pushing them, and finally the Germans managed to bring reinforcements in just as they got pushed out of the Argonne and across the river and stopped what was for sure to be a war-ending battle by bringing up the reserves from the Eastern Front. And so they managed to stop the Americans. And during this battle, there was another thing that Dimmer got to see, and that was the hero of the World Series of 1914, Hank Gowdy, was the color bearer for the 166. He had hit 545 in the World Series to be the hero. But now he was also a hero as he was carrying Old Glory at the front of the troops and charging into battle, a long way from a baseball field. This also helped inspire Dimmer and the rest of his men, because to see someone that didn't have to be there and be with them really inspired them. But again, they settled back into their trenches and again settled down for a long battle. Well, with this battle over, there were thousands and thousands of Americans killed. The Germans were now on the ropes. They knew that their time was numbered. And the Americans, they tried to dig in again, but again, Dimmer and the rest of the Letcher Countyans and the U.S. Army surged out of their trenches one more time and pushed them back again. This time they pushed them into Germany. And again, the Germans, with everything they could muster, managed to stop them. But now it was for sure the last line, and they drawed, as the old saying goes, they drawed the last line across the sand. The Germans gathered in. Everything they had was positioned against the Americans, and they settled down for a long onslaught in the trenches. And the reason why they were letting this go on is because they were trying to arrange a surrender, but they were trying to work out all the particulars of it. Well, while the officials and politicians were working out the particulars of the surrender, the men in the trenches, unfortunately, were suffering greatly. And they were suffering against something that was very bad, and it was called the sniper. And the Germans were very good at it. They had wrote the book on sniping at this point. And the snipers were taking its toll on the Americans. Every time they'd raise up, a bullet would either hit the helmet or go into a soldier's head. And everyone in the division knew that Dimmer was a very good shot, so he was selected to try to do away with the snipers. He had some success against them, but there was one in particular in the front of them that he just absolutely could not do anything with, because he was so good at what he done. His camouflage and his technique was great. He was constantly moving, that Dimmer couldn't never catch him. Well, this went on, and of course, the bodies started adding up. But at that time, the politicians finally managed to come to a truce. And on the 11th hour of the 11th month, the 11th day of the 11th month, which is November the 11th at 11 o'clock, on 1918, they come to an agreement and signed the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the World War I. Well, naturally, as soon as they signed, they notified all the soldiers, the commanders. The commanders was all telling, and they were broadcasting it by loudspeakers, and both armies began to rise up out of the trenches to celebrate, because even the Germans was happy it was over with, even though they had technically lost the war. Well, when they started rising up out of the trenches, the sniper that had worked on Dimmer's company so badly also rose up, and he began to taunt the Americans. And well, I guess it was more than they could stand, because some of his buddies egged him on, and Dimmer drawed down, and he shot and killed the sniper. Of course, the war was officially over with, so I guess you could say it was probably could be considered murder. And the officers immediately rushed to the scene and demanded to find out who it was. But everybody started taking credit for it, and nobody would say who had done it, other than they'd say, well, we all did it. And so that saved Dimmer probably from a firing squad, more than likely, or at least prison time. But so he escaped that time, and they stayed in the trenches for a little bit longer until they could finally muster them up, and they got them and put them on another cargo ship to bring them back home again. And this was called the USS Levington. And it wasn't really meant for that many men. And so when they put all those troops on this transport, the men even had to camp out on the decks, because they didn't even have enough room downstairs for them. But the Americans had so many men over there, they wanted to get them home quickly, and the men really didn't care. They were just glad to be going home. That they just went ahead and shipped out on these ships that way. Of course, Dimmer always said he was only sick one time on the way home, and that one time was from the time they left port till the time they entered the United States. He said he's sick from then the whole time, and I can see why. Well, when he got back to the United States, he went to Camp Zachary, Kentucky, and there they kept him and tried to calm him down a little bit before they went home. And when he did go home, though, he done another thing he shouldn't have never done, but he stole his Springfield rifle and took it home with him. And then my uncle and others, kids up and down the area, loved to watch him go down around Whit Cove, which is down below Whitesburg, and shoot fish in the river. And he would do it just to entertain them boys, because he knew they was getting a kick out of it, as did my uncle. And later on, Lloyd Brown, which was my uncle, he contributed to that with him being interested in being in the military as well. Of course, he went on to serve in World War II and get wounded and served bravely in the Philippines. But getting back to our story, Dimmer married and had a child, and he would buy, to make a living, since he was very sick, he had one of his lungs taken out due to the mustard gas. He began to buy white oak staves to make whiskey barrels with. And he done a very good job of it and managed to do pretty good. But unfortunately, he had made a few enemies over here as well, and one day he was ambushed and killed here in Letcher County. So he survived the war only to die here in the mountains. And he's buried in the Sand Lake Cemetery here right below Whitesburg, and he does have a military tombstone. Well, before we end, I would like to read a thing here, a list. This is to honor all of our Letcher County veterans, but especially the Letcher County veterans of World War I. And this is the list of the Letcher County veterans that did not make it home. These are the ones that made the ultimate sacrifice. So at this time, I'll read the list of our unsung heroes. John Adams, Ralph Adams, Clell Anderson, David N. Brown, George Brown, Sylvan Brown, Bradley Buckhart, Curtis Cornett, Douglas Day, Elijah B. Dixon, William Dixon, Charlie J. Ford, Patrick H. Hall, Joe Hardy, Henderson M. Hubbard, Emery Ego, Tom Johnson, Henry Maggard, George W. McKnight, Frank W. Scruggs, Joseph Sexton. Now this is the list of known Letcher County soldiers that give the ultimate sacrifice in World War I. I'm sure there were others, but if they had moved off or had gone out of state or joined from other places, they could be listed under different units, but these are the ones that are known to have died from Letcher County for sure, and I'm sure there were others. I would like everyone to always consider all soldiers as heroes, because I'm very firmly entrenched with the idea that all veterans are heroes in my eyes. And ask them their story sometime. Don't wait till they're gone. Ask them their story, because everybody has a story and everybody would love to tell it. Maybe you might have to coach them some, but they'll eventually tell you their story, and believe me, it's well worth it. And maybe try to write them down, or tell me about them and I'll write them down for you, because I would love to keep the records of all these American heroes alive. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for watching the Letcher County History Show and for watching the Government Channel. Thank you. Goodbye.